So I'm delighted to be here today, and greetings from North Carolina. I'm sorry that I wasn't able to travel to Brussels, but I do have, I think, a valid excuse. I'm going to talk today about climate change and sustainability from the standpoint of the interface of food and water. And just so that those of you who don't know me have a little bit of background, I'm a food microbiologist, and so consequently, I'm going to be talking about the food system with a focus on microbes and the impact of climate change on microbial populations and food safety. So I'm going to start with some definitions from the FAO/WHO relative to sustainable diets. While I'm not talking about nutrition in this presentation, nutrition is certainly a big consideration in this regard. And really, the definition is kind of a three-pronged definition with three major domains that are relative to sustainable foods. And those three domains, as defined at least by the paper that this figure was taken from, include human health, okay? In my case, that would be food safety, but could include nutrition. And then followed by environmentally friendly production and processing technologies, and then sufficient production in order to meet the world's demand. And really together, those come together to form sort of a pocket of sustainability and the issues that need to be considered in that regard. So how do we define climate change? Really, sort of historically, that has been defined as a statistically significant change in the distribution of weather over time, and time can range from millennia to a certain defined number of years. Generally, we talk about maybe a 50-year period as we've become more aware of climate change, and certainly as we predict out, we're going for maybe the next 50 to 100 years. Now, I'm going to, even though climate change is impacted by many different factors and has many different manifestations, I'm really going to focus on changes to temperature, humidity, and rainfall, as well as catastrophic weather events, because those are really the major drivers from a microbial standpoint, keeping in mind that other factors such as eutrophication, greenhouse gas emissions will impact all of those variables that affect the food supply and food safety relative to climate change. And I think that I don't need to tell this audience that it's pretty clear, at least for the last 15 to 20 years, that climate change is occurring, and that there is probably a high degree of human impact or human factors that are driving climate change. And this is a great figure that we actually use this in our the introduction for the ILSI North America charters. But this is a nice figure that's taken out of a paper that looked really at climate change and food security and health impacts in the developed world. It's important to realize that really a lot of this is also happening in the developing world, and we'll talk about that in a few minutes. So bottom line is you start with what are called anthropogenic changes or impacts, and those really are human-driven impacts, and also natural climate forcings that are occurring just by nature. And then that leads to trickle-down effects on the environment, and this is just a representative list of those effects. And then those then have their own trickle-down effects to the ag and food sector, and in the case of this particular presentation, changes to both food safety and nutrition. So why does global climate change matter in terms of food safety and security? And I have four major premises that sort of underlie this presentation. And the real central one is that water and food safety and security are intimately linked. In other words, you can't have a safe food supply without a safe water supply. nor can you have an abundant food supply without an abundant water supply. So that's a really important thing to sort of understand across the board. Water always affects food. Clearly, the major manifestations of climate change affect all phases of the farm to fork continuum. And so, we don't need to just consider agriculture. We have to consider ag and processing and up to retail, transportation, and consumers. Third is that climate change has direct and indirect impacts on the ecology of people, of animals, of pests, and of microbes. And many of the sort of scientific drivers, certainly in what's going on in animal and pest and microbial populations, has to do with competition between organisms. And climate change inherently, if you change the balance of microbial populations, you will change population dynamics. And that drives the emergence of pathogens as well as the proliferation of pathogens. And finally, these ecological changes all have trickle-down effects on human health. So, so why is it so important to have access to clean and abundant water? And this is this slide sort of gives some of the major points. There's certainly not all of them, but I do point out the figure on the right, which is really showing the trends in water availability from 1980. This is a little bit old, but from 1980 to a 2015 estimate. And you can see here that this has to do with water availability, right? Okay, and we're getting increasingly less green and more in the yellow and red zones. And this is important for lots of different reasons. We've already stated that water is essential to food production, processing, and preparation. We certainly, without water, can't perform adequate hygiene, which is a huge contributor to the safety of our food and water supply. Too much water, in other words, sort of flooding conditions, generally results in increased risk of fecal contamination to the water supply, which then can be transmitted to the food supply. And I really want to point out, and I think the maps on the right are fairly illustrative of this, is that water quality and security is disproportionately higher. In other words, it's better in the developed world. And that means that the developing world in some ways is experiencing more of the brunt of this water scarcity issue. And of course, climate change exacerbates these inequities. These are a couple of other maps looking at global drought hazard distribution from a mortality standpoint on the top, and flood distribution, again, with a mortality scale. That's the bottom figure. Again, I think that sort of big take homes here is that you see certain regions of the world that are at much higher risks for both drought and flood, and a high proportion of those areas are in the developing world, but also keep in mind that a good, increasing amount of the developed world is subject to these sorts of issues. So I've got three kind of overarching themes here, and the first we've really already talked about, which is the need for clean water in order to have safe foods. The second is that that while the entire food chain is technically or potentially impacted by the effects of global climate change and food safety, there really are sectors that seem to be, from a water standpoint or a water contribution standpoint, more affected. And those are the seafood sector because of oceans, the fresh produce sector largely because of irrigation and wash waters, and animal agriculture because water is used so extensively in both production and processing. And the last thing I'm going to talk about very briefly at the end is the fact that climate change results in increases in extreme weather events, which also have trickle-down effects to safety. So the first example I want to talk about is are the pathogenic Vibrio species in seafood. really with a focus on molluscan shellfish. That's the greatest risk for pathogenic Vibrios. Now, for those of you who aren't microbiologists, the pathogenic Vibrio species are naturally occurring marine organisms, so they're naturally in the water column. And some of them, not all of them, but some of them are pathogenic to humans. And the big ones are Vibrio cholera, which is associated with cholera, and then parahemolyticus, which causes a gastrointestinal disease, and vulnificus, which causes a very severe septic illness that has a high mortality rate in at-risk populations, although it is and still remains a relatively rare disease. So pathogenic Vibrios, or Vibrios in general, are interesting because they're naturally in the water column, and the balance of these pathogens versus the sort of the non-pathogenic strains can change. And they're also very quick growers. They grow very rapidly. In fact, they have a generation rate that's faster than almost any other bug that we have characterized. And so what we've seen, and this is pretty well documented at this point, is that climatic influences have driven elevated seawater and surface temperatures. That's the major driver. Eutrophication and salinity changes that generally are associated with that kind of thing is sort of a secondary driver. And this has increased both the concentrations of these pathogenic strains and also facilitated their emergence in areas that had previously never seen a case of Vibrio vulnificus, for example. And there really are two, I think, really great specific examples of this. One is the Peruvian Vibrio cholera outbreak that happened in the 1990s, which was many, many years ago, which was driven by kind of a combination of increases in global travel. Bilge water from Asia was released into the waters in South America or outside of Lima. And that served as a seeding event. And then those waters were historically high in temperature, which was the driver for the growth of cholera and then the subsequent infection in the population. So a really great example from very early on. We've also more recently seen emergence of parahemolyticus and vulnificus in northern European Baltic regions, particularly when water temperatures are at higher levels, and also increased regional distribution of disease in North America. So states that have not seen Vibrio infections, which tend to be in the northern part of our country, and even into Canada, are now seeing infections. So fresh produce is another really interesting one. We do have quite a bit of data now showing that enteric bacterial pathogens in fresh produce and their contamination of that product is at least in part impacted by climate changes. These bugs, and really the ones we're talking about are things like Salmonella and pathogenic E. coli, are often zoonotic in origin, so they almost always arise from animal fecal contamination. And right here is kind of a list of all the ways that climate change has impacted how we raise animals, and also the contact between animals and animal fecal matter, as well as fresh produce. And it's actually quite documented at this point that persistence and dispersal of these key foodborne pathogens here are all driven by the increases in temperature and length of warmer seasons, increases particularly in rainfall, and wind and dust events. And again, as I said, climate change is a driver for all of these types of manifestations. So what are kind of the mediating factors? If you look specifically across the supply chain in fresh produce, and you can see here that you have temperature, rainfall, extreme events with your environmental conditions, leading to these types of issues in food production, distribution, and consumption, and associated health impacts. If you look over at the table on the right, which was taken directly from the Lake and Barker paper, this was a wonderful study where they actually looked at the body of evidence supporting an impact of global climate change on these key foodborne pathogens in the in higher income countries. And they found that a high degree of evidence supports E. coli, Listeria, and pathogenic E. coli emergence, or not emergence, but presence and causes of illness as being directly linked to climate change. And this is another figure or another table taken from another paper that actually sort of supports that evidence overall. So it's really clear that in conclusion about fresh produce that we are seeing these increases in cases in outbreaks of enteric disease associated with fresh produce in our country as well as worldwide. And climate change is in part a driver for that. Next to the last thing I want to talk about is a little bit about water reuse. Or water reclamation, which is a pretty hot topic right now with the anticipation that of water scarcity on a global basis over the next several decades. And I wanted to give you some statistics just so that you would know how important the use of water is in agriculture and the food supply. And I think these are fascinating that 70% of the world's fresh water withdrawals are used for irrigation, which is crazy. That's a huge amount of water. And yet only about 29% of the water that's recycled or reclaimed is used in irrigation. Interestingly, livestock rearing doesn't really use that much water, but animal slaughter uses a tremendous amount, and processing uses a tremendous amount of water. And here's some recent statistics for broilers and beef. We don't necessarily have great stats for every type of food product, but we do have some for these. So the whole issue of water reuse in production and processing could be a presentation in and of itself. So I can only go through some of this pretty briefly. I do want to say that there are very few regulations about the appropriate and approved uses of reclaimed or recycled water in food production or processing. When they occur, they're usually regionally designated, certainly commodity specific, and usually based on FAO water quality guidelines. There are a few recent documents here that I have cited so that you can refer to those at your leisure if you're interested in more information on this. The FAO WHO document that came out in 2019 is excellent. And the big take home with reclaimed or reused water is that it must be, quote, clean or defined as clean, and also fit for purpose. And fit for purpose means that its use is designated specifically related to lots of different factors, including the source of the water, the types of hazards that might be linked to the water, the technology that's being used to produce the reclaimed water, as well as whether the food, as well as the final way the food will be consumed by the consumer. And it's really important to understand that there are very few microbiological criteria that have been established for reused or reclaimed water. But the WHO FAO document of 2019 is very clear that these decisions should be risk-based. And I've pulled a couple figures from that document to sort of give you a quick feel for what this means. According to their recommendations, and this was an expert panel paper, the very first step is to determine the context in which the food is to be eaten, and this is a specific example for fresh produce. And usually that is whether or not the product will be eaten raw or cooked, and also how the irrigation water is going to be sourced as well as used. And then based on that, we put together sort of a risk profile where we can look at products that would be at higher risk, moderate risk, or low risk for causing foodborne disease if we were to use reclaimed or recycled water. And that's on the right-hand side of this slide. And then from there, they perform a really nice flow diagram that looks like, okay, if you have a low-risk product, these are the decisions you have to make in order to use reused water. If you have a medium risk, it would be this, you know, a separate set of scenarios, and if it's high risk, a third set of scenarios. And this particular document does this for many different foods in the supply chain, including this is fresh produce, but including seafood, certain seafoods, as well as meat and poultry. Very briefly, relative to extreme weather, this is a nice paper that came out looking specifically at waterborne disease. They did a very extensive review and a systematic, more or less a meta-analysis. And basically, the findings of this were that heavy rainfall and flooding were responsible for about 50% of waterborne outbreaks that were investigated or identified in this study, and that there are certain pathogens that are more often associated with these events, those being Vibrio in particular. Now, this is specific for waterborne, but remember that water impacts food. And then the final thing I wanted to point out is that there actually are some risk assessments that are being done in this area to develop support for decision making relative to management of food safety in the eye of an increasingly changing global climate situation. And this particular tool was great in that it looked at a variety of different products and a variety of different pathogens. To conclude, and I'm getting very close to the end of this, I do want to just point out the complexity of managing this problem. And this is a wonderful table that illustrates kind of, well, as we transition towards more sustainability, and addressing the impacts of climate change relative to food safety, these are the kinds of things we might make decisions to do, and these are the kinds of ways in which those decisions might increase our risk for contamination. So, for example, we could replace synthetic fertilizers with organic fertilizers to improve sustainability, but then we become more worried about the potential for fecal contamination. We can use we can look at different ways of addressing our soil, for example, but as we monkey around with the microbial population in the soil, that can then cause or be an impetus for changes in populations and potentially growth or emergence of pathogens. So this is just a list of some of the future directions. Clearly, this is a complex issue. I know that in the ILSI charters around in North America, around this area, there's a big push for more research, for the use of multidisciplinary teams, for multinational cooperation. And in terms of actually dealing with the issue, we clearly need better epidemiological surveillance and monitoring, as well as predictive models and risk assessment in order to adequately manage. So I was asked to include sort of take-home message points in the last slide, and I will reiterate the importance of water for safe food. Also reiterate the fact that the major manifestations of climate change really impact all sectors of the farm to fork food safety chain. It is extraordinarily difficult to tease apart the specific role of climate change on food and water safety. And we definitely need more work in that regard. That work must have global reach, certainly be multidisciplinary and relevant to sustainability. And I will be happy to take questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. There's a question here. Right here, Mike. Here, the card.
Good afternoon, ma'am. Nice presentation. So
Thank
for
you.
one of my question you have answered, so what will be the expected microorganism for the extreme weather events you have given in the review article? So my question is, you have told the unusable water. So there are the different categories you have listed, low risk water, medium risk and high risk water. So any positive microorganism could make the unusable water or untreated water into a better usable quality water.
Correct, and that's really the issue that the National Advisory Committee paper that I didn't really talk about. I mean, I just cited it. Goes into great detail about what are the potential risks of using reclaimed or reused water and how you might manage those risks. Okay, but that's the concern is that there might even be small amounts of a pathogen present, but if you're not doing full water treatment for potable water, that you would have remainder pathogens present, and then that could a couple things could go directly on product, but also could contaminate the environment if it were used, let's say, for irrigation.
Another question, ma'am. So is there any possibility of emerging a new microorganism would solve the problem? So now we are speaking in the context of climate change. All the temperature and rainfall patterns, everything is changing. So any existing pathogens maybe got shifted or new invasive microorganism could emerge to maneuver this situation, or any positive or negative feedback will be there?
Yeah, that's a really, really great question. And most of what we know at this point is anecdotal. Okay, so it has not necessarily been, codified by intensive studies. I think a pretty good example in the United States is that we have seen pretty much every year since about 2017, massive or relatively massive, large, I should say, outbreaks associated with romaine lettuce. And that has, and while we don't know this, I mean, we know that some of the drivers of how that contamination is occurring, these are pathogenic E. coli strains. We do think that there are things that are happening climatically that are driving the likelihood and also the persistence of these pathogens in that particular product. But again, it hasn't, we're in the process of studying it. The FDA is actually doing a lot of work in this area. But we don't, again, it's really hard to tease out how much of this is climate change and how much of this is other factors.
Thank you, ma'am.
Any other question in the platform? There's any? Ellen, do you know? Any questions? Okay, I have one. Because we are, it's supposed, ending a pandemic. And how to work with these free markets around the world. I am from Costa Rica, and there's a lot of markets where there is no safety systems inside.
Yeah.
And I feel that sometimes all these initiatives go through the industry, and all the time they have um, food safety systems. How to work with other markets, these other markets who are impacting our lives all the time.
So, and what do you mean when you say other markets? How are you defining that?
These free markets with no safety systems, or yes, I don't know, for example, in India and Latin America, there's
I
these
got it. Okay.
big markets, fresh
Yeah.
fruits and animals running across.
Yeah.
How
Yeah.
to do that?
And keep in mind, I'm American, so I'm going to give you an American perspective here, okay? But your point is very well taken, because one of the issues that we're seeing in produce in the United States is not all, but many of the products that are going into recall or are causing outbreaks are not originating in production in the United States. They're originating from other countries. And the federal government is doing stuff to try to, they'll put an embargo on product that comes from a certain importer or something like that. But it is the companies that are supplying from other countries that are ultimately responsible. And I think that companies really are struggling with that right now. And we could talk about testing till the cows come home, but oftentimes the way a large company assures that a product coming from another market is safe is to ask for a certificate of analysis. But that's not really going to, that tells you that the test was negative, but it doesn't tell you that the product is absence of a pathogen. So I don't have an answer to that, except that I know that industry is really struggling with this particular issue. And then when you add to that the fact that you really can't make trade restrictions, okay, because of World Trade Organization rules, you also have to be sensitive to what you can and cannot do. Yeah, so that's not an answer. It's probably just more questions.
Well, I think it's a question for all. Well, thank you very much, Professor.
Thank
We really
you.
appreciate your time.